What I would like to do is make 3 points about the context that I see trade agreements being concluded or failing or being attempted over the next actually few decades, but particularly over the next couple of decades. In defending the freedoms so I thought eloquently expressed by our leaders this morning, we have a lot of issues confronting all of us, especially countries like Australia and Germany, with a great commitment and a demonstrated commitment to freedoms, but also to liberalisation. And I suppose it's a bit of a theme of what I'm saying, but the 3 issues in terms of context that will confront all of those policymakers over the years ahead. Firstly, what we're seeing is most of the developed world, or much of it, if not most, is going protectionist. That observation's been made by previous speakers at this conference. While much of the developing world, which is not often referred to in this sense, is liberalising. We've got the developed closing up, and we've got, certainly across Asia, we're seeing quite extraordinary liberalisation taking place. And that apparent contradiction really has at its heart the issue of liberalisation. The developed world in many cases, and some very prominent cases, is restricting the freedoms, the restructuring internally, and a lot of the traditional liberalisation that delivered so much prosperity to so many of the countries that are now in the developed world going in the opposite direction. So I think the apparent contradiction between the developed and the undeveloped, or developing, is due to the same issue. It's how liberalisation is being treated or not treated. I've observed in the developed world that earlier liberalisation of trade and investment, combined with globalisation, 2 sides of the same coin in a way, has delivered big gains for many, but of course it has delivered losses. Even back in the Industrial Revolution, there were losers. There are lots of winners, more winners than losers, but when you do get change, you get losers. I think the problem is that the politics in dealing with the losers in the developed world has driven demands for protectionism, and sadly some key politicians in those countries have very comprehensively capitulated. And it's blamed often on others. There's always a convenient political scapegoat or others outside your country. So protectionism and inappropriate investment coming into countries is the scapegoat. When actually, if you look at some of our prominent economies which are going protectionist, the failure is domestic. The failure has its root in anti-liberalisation initiatives within those countries, or policies which are not addressing some of the losers in those countries, not anticipating that all this growth and prosperity brings with it change and some losers who need to be equally looked after and directed, if you like, assisted to take a part of that prosperity. So you get things like inadequate safety nets. You get things like some countries, the United States for instance, the land of entrepreneurship is so anti-privatisation. They've got trillions of dollars worth of lazy assets all over the country, and yet local politics, inability to structurally adjust, means that politicians take it as conventional wisdom that we're opposed in the US to privatisation, which is another form of providing flexibility and helping the losers find jobs and opportunities that otherwise wouldn't occur. So you could go into many areas where the failure is domestic policy and the scapegoat is trade, is foreign countries doing something inappropriate in their view. Conversely, in the developing world, the reverse is true. There's an unprecedented economic revolution going on. It's been going for really 2 or 3 decades now, and it has led to millions, hundreds of millions of people now moving out of poverty, being lifted out of poverty. And at the root of it is economic liberalisation. There mightn't be political liberalisation, and there might be consequences for that in due course, but economic liberalisation has driven this unprecedented growth and prosperity, without a doubt. You look in places like China, but Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, some of them have not yet liberalised externally, but they're liberalising internally. You look at India, very difficult to get trade agreements and investment agreements with India, but it's coming. But at the moment, there's such a big economy, you're seeing in India the liberalisation under Modi is just quite remarkable, and it is leading to an economy which is having 8% year-on-year growth. And it is seeing people come out of poverty, and it is seeing some remarkable results. But it's liberalisation is at the root of it. And when they'll get, like China has, got to a point where now they need to take that liberalisation into a global environment, into a trade and investment environment. And this is the pattern we're starting to see across the ASEAN countries and the Asia-Pacific region and India. So it's driven in many ways by a demand to see people, the lifestyle of people, the humiliation of many of those countries over the last 200 years is a factor. They've got pride, they're trying to restore, they've got prosperity they want to give to their people, and they want to stand tall again. And they are. They're going hell for leather with that objective, and it's fantastic to see. And, you know, no one should be in a position to try and discourage what we're seeing. We might want to shape some of the outcomes and some of the consequences, but we must applaud what we're seeing going on across the region. And I think there's a political imperative in the region. It's not because necessarily all the leaders across the region are good guys and girls. It's because there is a development that's come with technology, this technological digital revolution. It's delivered a mobile phone. And what you see is still 300 million people in poverty in China. They've all got a mobile phone. They never did through history. They didn't know what they were missing out on. You've got 600 million in India who are on less than $2 a day, 300 million of them without electricity. But for the first time in history, they know what they haven't got, because the mobile phone. And I've been on the ground in all these countries, it's true, but in the negotiations trade negotiations I've done, my counterpart on the other side of the table, every time I got to an area or a product which was a cornerstone of certain very poor areas, the nervousness would be palpable because the politics of those groups in history, those groups intended the ignorant and the poor were kept under control by keeping them ignorant and poor. Well, nowadays that is not possible, and it's having a very material impact on the politics and the demand for growth in these countries, strong demand for growth and jobs. And the interesting thing is that that awareness of the desperately poor is creating enormous pressure, and the governments of many of these countries have realised that unless they keep the liberalisation going, unless they start to progressively open up to the rest of the world, they are not going to provide the expectations now of very large pockets, in many cases hundreds of millions, of desperately poor. And so there is a political imperative in the developing world to get on with liberalisation. There's a political imperative seen by certain governments in the developed world to stop liberalisation. So it's an interesting conundrum. But it's a reality that we all have to be aware of if we are seeking to liberalise trade and investment in the years ahead. The second context, the development that I think is affecting trade agreements so profoundly is the walking away from freer trade by the US, the dumping of the TPP. Now, we're always careful about how we deal with this subject because they're a great friend of ours and an alliance partner and all the rest. But I'm telling you, as someone who's just had 24 trips in the last 15 months in the region, on the ground in so many areas, it has had a profound effect on the geopolitics of the region. Now, the trade issue is important and desperately important, but the geopolitics is even more important. The standing of the US for many countries has been diminished. It's compounded the political uncertainties of a strongly re-emerging China. People were getting used to the progressive change and increasing size and influence of China, etc., but were comforted by the fact that the US remained unambiguously one of leadership within the region, seeking to keep the balance of power so richly valued by many countries in our region has been wantonly undermined. And confusion reigns in so many of these countries as to where they place themselves on so many issues, and including trade and investment, when obviously for the whole region, I think excluding India, our biggest trading partner is China. So again, it's a really unfortunate development. The US action has created, from my observation, a leadership vacuum that I suspect China will be only too happy to seek to fill. And the thing is, the lesson is that leadership needs to be constantly, continuously earned. Not assume leadership, but earn it. And actions like this really do undermine the earning of a leadership capability. The great irony is that by far the biggest beneficiary of the TPP would be the USA, both in a trade sense, but as I say, almost more importantly, in maintaining an appropriate balance of leadership in a fastly changing Asia-Pacific region. A region, the TPP, covering 40% of world GDP. So all efforts, in my view, to reinstate the TPP, including starting with a 11 in a TPP, any effort to that end, to put pressure on the Americans to eventually participate, any effort is of immense importance. Finally, there needs to be, I think, a greater acknowledgement of the reality that China and India are heading inexorably back during this century. It's not going to come tomorrow, but during this century, inexorably back to the role they assumed for 18 of the last 20 centuries around the globe. Namely, those two countries, India and China, shared at different times with others, the Romans and the Turks and whatever, but they shared the political and economic centre of gravity across the world, not just across our region. And this time they will share it with the US, of course. But the fact is they will share it, and it's history again. You've got to look at history. This can be an easy transition and a constructive transition, or it can be an ugly transition. And this has to be managed. And, endless discussion in some countries of containment and all the rest is red rag to a bull. In my view, we've got to be clever about how we deal with this. It's very difficult issue, but at the end of it, there's enormous prosperity for hundreds, in fact, billions of people in the region, and a lot of that will be the beneficiaries, and Germany will be the beneficiaries, because it's a global centre of activity is Asia for the next century. It'll be the driver of growth for the next century, and the world has got to benefit from this. All of us have to be a part of this as beneficiaries. Now, recognising this reality, I think, and calibrating political and trade policy accordingly provides the best prospect of this transition occurring with a minimum of tension and conflict, with the maintenance of peace and stability and prosperity. In a trade sense, the ultimate formation in our region, and Germany will benefit from this because of all the reasons that we've heard articulated by our leaders over the last 24 hours or so. In a trade sense, the ultimate formation of an Indo-Pacific free trade zone carries with it a unifying force which builds mutual respect, which is at the heart of any successful relationship, mutual respect, which builds mutual respect and mutual benefits. And it will provide a stable region which our friends such as Germany can best engage with. In the meantime, in heading towards that objective, I do think the range of bilateral and regional trade agreements that are being countenanced, that are in progress, etc., all of these are a very important part of building that ultimate single zone in this region, because it will be like a whole set of building blocks which in the end build a wall, which is not a wall like we know in some other parts of the world, but build a structure that will deliver prosperity and peace and maximise the strengths of all the countries that make up the Asia-Pacific region, and to the benefit of the globe and our friends around the globe. Thank you very much.